Thank you all for coming back to us. Thank you for being here. What a wonderful first part of our Justice Assembly Day we had in speaking about democracy. Yes, small d in democracy and the large D in democracy. Thank you for returning. I am an avid believer in mindfulness. So what I would like you to do is just to put your feet on the ground. You know, you've just came back from lunch. So to put your feet on the ground or to just to find a comfortable place where you are and breathe. Breathing in, I know that I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know that I am breathing out. Breathing in, I notice my in-breath become deeper. Breathing out, I notice that my out-breath have become slower. Breathing in, I calm myself. Breathing out, I feel at ease. Breathing in, I smile. Breathing out, I release. Breathing in, I dwell in this present moment. Breathing out, I feel it is a wonderful moment. There is a hymn in our hymnal in which we sing, and it's hymn number 298. And the title of that hymn is Wake Now My Senses. I want you to listen to the very fourth stanza of that song as we play this video.
Wake now my conscience with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race.
Thank you. Now, if you recall those words of that song, it says, Wake now my conscience with justice thy guide, join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place, God's love, whatever God you have, and Mother God that you have, embraces the whole human race. When I think of justice, I always think of justice as this flowing down a river. There's an old saying that says that when peace flows like a river and justice like the waves of the sea, just imagine, or maybe you have done this as a kid, you know, that you've jumped off a rock into a lake. And as you go deeper into that lake and you come up, it's like you're experiencing a euphoria. And for me, that is what it feels like where justice is concerned. Jumping into justice, jumping into equity, jumping into equality. And therefore, as you come up from that lake, there is a refreshment in which you have. Now, that form of refreshment is what I had when I walked into my first UU church. Imagine the first sermon I heard was Jesus Christ and social justice. I began to say, wow, Jesus Christ and social justice is keenly associated. And yes, it was. So I began to take a deep dive into not only what the social justice means, but also how is it that social justice is refined and therefore spoken about within the context of Unitarian Universalism. So the very first book that I received was a book that was entitled Unitarian Universalism and the Quest for Racial Justice. I began to read the book. I began to understand why is it that this journey onto social justice have left a legacy and left a trail of how do we do that. But during that time also, I discovered another book. This book was by Reverend Kenneth Collier, and the book was entitled Our Seven Principles. For those who may be taking notes or writing it down, the book is by Reverend Kenneth Collier, and it was entitled, and it is entitled, Our Seven Principles. So I began to learn more about what is the meaning of what our seven principles are. So I began to equate our seven principles with a Greek word, tolos. Now, tolos is a form of Greek philosophy, and it carries the meaning of a goal, a consummation, a completion. And yeah, and when I began to read that, I began to say, wow, Unitarian Universalists have these principles in which it took me many years within the Anglican faith when I served as a priest. It was all wrapped up in seven principles. Seven principles. Yeah, that makes some sense to me as I look at what those seven principles are. Now, tolos also, it represents an objective. It represents a way as to how we sought out with diligence and commitment, with understanding, that gives us who we are as humans, our human limitations, and probably sometimes we have never met that. So as we look back at how these seven principles came about, and we look back starting from 230 CE with Origen of the principles, and up to 1833 with the General Convention of Unitarian Universalism, and then in 1843 when the Universalist Church was actually established in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Then, as we move on into 1888, where Universalism was declared to be the sixth largest denomination in the United States. Yes, at that time, in 1888. Then moving up in 1937, that is when the Universalists considered a merged with Unitarians. And then in 1985, wow, I'm getting my dates all mixed up here. In 1985 was when our principles and purposes were adopted. So when we think of our seven principles is not that old. I mean, we're actually speaking of what, 1985 to now, 36 years. It's not that old. But like most things, there's always an evolving process that occurs. So I began to look at what our first principle is. Our first principle says the inherent worth and dignity of every person. A couple of months ago, I was given a similar discussion, and I heard someone said, the inherent worth and dignity of every person sounds like all lives matter. And I would say, yeah, all lives matter. But then again, the question is, according to the book in which Reverend Collier had asked us, is everyone worthy? Does everyone have inherent dignity? Will we always behave in a worthy or dignified way? If life is all worthy, how is it that we can rationalize or justify war, capital punishment, slavery, oppression? Yeah, those are questions sometimes which pops up, which came up in my mind. Now, Again, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It doesn't say that the inherent worth and dignity of like-minded people or people who are willing to enter into some kind of a rational or civilized discourse with us, although we want to, as the question that was asked, the fact that how is it that we could have the conversation with those on the other side. But that first principle does not say that people with whom we may disagree, but who are honorable or as genuine in their beliefs as we are in ours, it says every person. So we are also called to affirm that the inherent worth and dignity, the people to whom we thoroughly dislike, people we find obnoxious, obstreperous, overbearing, frightening, people who sometimes have abhorrent beliefs which is not like ours. So there's questions there that came up as far as how is it that we look at the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So let's skip down to principle number 2. Our second principle says about justice, equity, and compassion in human relationship. What does that mean? First of all, the question is, what does justice mean? We have heard a lot about justice over these past couple of weeks. Does justice mean just holding up a plaque and walking in the streets and saying, this is what I stand for. This is what I do. This is what I believe in. Because I am holding up a plaque and I'm walking down the streets and so forth, is that what justice is? Now, that could be a part of justice, of course. The question is also, how do we incorporate that with social justice? Sometimes it makes me think that, is it the fact that our thoughts have become lazy or therefore less applicable, that we don't want to go to the depth and the width and the length and the breadth of what it means to have justice? Can justice exist without equity? And how does legal justice, social justice, economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, moral justice relate? Are they compatible? So again, there's questions there that comes up. And another question that comes up also, it's about that will of democracy. Democracy. How does democracy fits in with justice? So yes, questions sometimes appear in our minds and hearts, and sometimes when we become critical thinkers and we begin to look at what the principles we have, sometimes it invokes discussion in which we all should have. Now let's go back at that very first principle there, right? Without an understanding and acceptance of our own worth and dignity, it seems as if it would be hard to carry out the dignity of every person who will not be receiving justice, right? That just goes by its own saying. So in order for us to demand justice of all people and for people, we need to acknowledge that we are all worthy. There cannot be true justice if the least of a legal justice contains no acknowledgement of morality. It's only law. So the question makes us to think, how is our laws therefore rendering justice? Laws in which we fight for. And we're going to talk some more about that later. So as we look at principle number 7, which is kind of an interesting principle for me, and I'm going to tell you why in a few seconds. Our principles our seventh principle speaks about the respect for the independent web of all in existence of which we are a part. Sometimes I think that should be our first principle because it speaks about that independent web. But I think it's interesting that how we have alluded to the seventh principle and we have allotted it to have its application to environmental justice more so. Is that true? Is that how it should be? No, it says in the respect for the independent web of all existence in which we are all a part of. So, and again, friends, this is just a small sample of the ways as to how our principles are, was created back in 1985, and it was adopted by both Unitarians and Universalists. So the question still comes up, is there more? Is there more that we need? Now, our religion and beliefs, it's not dogmatic, but there's always room for growth. And that growth sometimes involving us looking at who we say we are. Because if we're saying this is who we're about, then our principles and everything, it should act in harmony. So in 2005, I met a dear friend of mine by the name of Paula Cole Jones. I met Paula back in New England. You know, I was a part of a team up there. The team was actually called GRACE, G-R-A-C-E. And what that meant was growing racial and cultural equity. You know, it's a pretty nice name, really. And that name was actually borrowed from the folks in the Pacific, I think, yeah, in our Pacific district. And they were sunsetting that team. So I heard of that name and I said, you know, I'm gonna just call the folks out in the West Coast and, you know, and ask them, I said, listen, could we carry on your name in legacy? And they said, of course you can. So that's where I met Paula. And Paula began to tell me and to say, hey, you know, Samuel, there's a couple of things in which I've been carrying around in my head about look at our principles. Is our principles reaching everyone? Folks come into our UU environment, into our Unitarian Universalist environment, and therefore, what does that mean for them? How is it that our principles could actually be fulfilled? So Paula had shared with me at that time the formation of what we're now asking our congregations to adopt. It's our proposed now. It is a proposed eighth principle. And the eighth principle goes like this. It reads like this. We, the member congregations of Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. That sounds like Black Lives Matter, right? Okay. So when we look at what the proposed principle is, and again, the fact that this is what is being proposed at our General Assembly in which we had in 2017, this principle was put for a study commission. So probably it may not be voted on in 2022 or 2023, dependent upon what you and I do. So when looking at the eighth principle or the proposed eighth principle, see, the word social justice is not even mentioned there, right? It speaks about journeying towards spiritual wholeness. And then it says to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. So it may not be speaking to racial justice. It may be, I'm sorry, let me take that back. It's our principles in which we have, our 7 principles, does not speak to implicitly towards racial justice, but it is implied. So when we read what our proposed 8th principle is, it speaks directly to racial justice. It speaks towards race and racism. It speaks towards the beloved community. It speaks towards oppressions in ourselves and in our institution. There was a report which was released by the Commission on Institutional Change last year at our General Assembly. And there it says that many of our congregations are in trouble with dwindling membership, participation, and financial contributions. A factor that contributes towards that is our inability to address inclusion, our inability to address equity, our inability to address diversity. Now, this is a discussion in which UUJO, which will be starting on May the 26th. We actually had it scheduled for May 19th, but though we will move it back a week. Now, why? Why is it that many of our congregations are in trouble? Again, it says because of the factor that contributes, the inability to address inclusion, equity, and diversity. Now let's go back and look at what the proposed 8th principle says in regards to that. It says, journeying towards spiritual wholeness. Now, when we say spiritual wholeness, what does that mean? Now, if we remove all the ecclesiastical meaning of what the word spiritual is, it just means about a holistic way. The holistic way of mind over matter. I mean, how is it that my spirit, the goodness of what my spirit is, or the wholeness of what my spirit has, could be a way of my enacting of my interactions with another person. So the spirit of the proposed 8th principle moves within us to be that guiding force that moves us towards action. Another word within the principle, though, and which I really like, is the word by. It says, again, just let me read this over, say that we, the membership congregations of Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working. Now, if we look at, there's the preposition by. It means in proximity, right? It means in relationship with. So if I am working towards spiritual wholeness, I will be working with that in relationship to building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community in proximity, in relationship with. But then the question means, which we may ask, is what this beloved community means, multicultural, beloved community means, we live in a world whereby there is flight, fight, or freeze. There is no flocking. There is no uniting. There is no ascending. Most times we don't see each other as human beings. I think, who said that in our morning session? I don't recall if it was Senator Leland or Representative Antonio, or do I have that backward? Yes, but it was one of them. I said that we don't see each other as human beings, that democracy should work for everyone. So becoming involved in a beloved community, and we know that phrase came from Martin Luther King. So what does that mean? It means a society which is based on justice, which is based on equal opportunity, the love of your fellow human. But I think it also have another meaning. It also means community within communities. We can't have a beloved community if we don't have communities, because we all may not think alike, we all may not look alike, but then when you have those communities within a community, and then everyone comes back within that larger framework of community, then we all should be on that very same page. Again, we should be. So the fact that the proposed aid principle is asking us that we should look at ourselves, it's asking us to create the building of a multicultural, beloved community, is in essence saying the fact that yes, we will not all be alike, whether it's by our ethnicity, whether it's by our speech, whether it's by this or by that, we will not all be alike. But there is a common goal in which we all have. But then also the proposed aid principle goes on to say the way we could build this community is by accountably dismantling racism. That is another word we had heard so much these past couple of weeks. Accountability. What does that mean? Where it says accountably dismantling racism. For me, that when I look at the word accountability means the fact that I answer for my actions. I mean, we're all imperfect. And there is things in which we will do, whereby we could rub someone else the wrong way. And friends, I could tell you a whole lot of my share of that. But as I become responsible for those actions, then I could find a way to be accountable with grace and also with firm grace. I read a book once by Paul Kaival, and Paul Kaival wrote the book on uprooting and dismantling racism. And he said that sometimes listening is not enough. He even felt that even his actions is not enough. He's always looking for ways as to how he could make a difference in his life and therefore in other people's lives. Now, I recall 1968. I recall the 1968 Olympics, which was held in Mexico City. And talking about making a difference in people's lives, I remember as a kid, I was watching on TV the 200 meters being run. You know, I've always been a huge track and field fan. At that event, something happened. When the gold medalists and the silver medalists and the bronze medalists stood up to receive their medals, they did an action. Some of you may recall. John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their right hand. They were wearing the black gloves. And Peter Norman, we don't hear too much about Peter Norman. Peter Norman was from Australia. And Peter Norman was wearing a badge. The badge, it was the OPHR badge was on his arm. Now, he didn't wear a white gloves, but he was showing that I am in harmony with these two Black athletes who were raising their fists and saying, power, justice, where is it? It could be found in America. Now, these men's lives were changed from that moment. Peter Norman was disavowed by the Australian government. He never ran the Olympics again, although he had the record. John Carlos and Tommy Smith, they were ostracized when they came back to America. Yes, sometimes friends, being an activist or being someone who is fully involved in asking for change and speaking about change, sometimes it could be a lonely place. Because most times, whenever we're thinking about ending racism, if we don't end white supremacy and vice versa, if we don't end white supremacy but don't end racism, but if we don't end racism and not end white supremacy, it could be a lonely place. And that is what is meant by when the report that came out last year from the commission said that how is it our congregations can be inclusive? How could they be diverse? But also, how is it they could find ways as to how they could dismantle racism? I've always thought that white supremacy, it operates in this ideological orientation as to whereby we all subscribe to. You know, I always say that we all have the DNA of white supremacy in us because that is what we were, that's what we have. Those were the efforts, those were the conditions and environment in which you and I were raised. So it stays here with us now. It stays more for white people than, therefore, Black, Indigenous people of color are fighting back. Now, our allies need to be on the same page with us. So if we oversimplify just speaking about the Ku Klux Klan or the Proud Boys or something like that, I usually feel we're not really having the deep-seated discussions in which we should have. I think of a report that came out a couple of weeks back when a certain congresswoman or so forth and others, they were looking to actually form what was called America First Caucus. Yeah, white nationalism have taken its deep-seated hold, not just into our DNA, but also within our government, within the laws in which we're looking to create. But also the proposed 8th principle also speaks about actions which are oppressive in ourselves and our institutions. Now, what are some of these systemic oppressions in which may be out there? There's various phobias in which we may have. We may have LGBTQ phobias. We may have matriarchy, we may have patriarchy, ableism, xenophobia, economic, we have voter suppression, we have political oppression. We have even housing, as what we heard about this morning. I mean, housing plays a big part as far as people who cannot live. And then when we put on that other layers of things in which is there within our lives, it just makes the issues larger. The essence and the core of the proposed eight principle, friends, is to strip away the individualism and the silo ambiances in which we carry. It acts in direct converse to being just an elitist, individualism. But the eighth principle, the proposed eighth principle, calls for community. It calls for me being accountable to you and you being accountable to me. As I said previously, that the word justice, you don't see the word justice in the proposed eighth principle. Why? Why is the word justice is not there? The reason why I think the word justice is not there, it is kind of wrapped up in a quote in which I heard a couple of months ago. It says that we must understand that justice is a practice, not an end. So if you are practicing dismantling racism, if you are practicing building a community, a beloved community, if you are practicing removing oppressions in yourself and in our institutions, justice will be there. There is a quote also in which Colonel West said. Colonel West said that justice is what love looks like in public. So if we are loving to another person, but also it's something interesting too about the word love. We don't see the word love in our 7 principles, right? It's not there, but there is compassion. So if we are practicing love, we will be practicing what justice means. So what does that mean for us who are here? Some of us are here from Worcester or Athens or from North UU, Columbus, St. John's, Maumee Valley, Great Circle Fellowship, and we may even have others who are non-UUs, non-Unitarian Universalists. Sometimes I look at the visions in which many churches have. I look at the vision. I look at what is it the visions is telling me? What is it their vision and mission is telling me about who they are? Sometimes within their vision and mission have the words of spirituality. Working for social justice appears often in the mission and vision of many of our churches. But then I ask a question, what does that mean? We have it in the mission, we have it in the vision. Are we aspiring to be that way, or are we living into it? So what I always ask those who I run into within my UU spaces is, are you practicing what justice is within your walls of your congregations? And are you practicing what justice means outside of those walls of your congregations? So I will urge you, I'm going to ask you who have remained here. I think 42 of us have remained here now. If you are a Unitarian Universalist, take a look at what your mission and vision says. Ask the questions. What does it mean when my congregation says that it's practicing social justice? What does it mean when it says that there is a mission of justice within my church? What does that mean? Justice is not passive. Justice is active. Justice asks me to do something. It's ask you to carry out an action. So by means of you and I becoming familiar with what the term means or what the entire proposed aid principle means and dissecting that. See how is it that your congregation could fit within the mold of what it is asking you and I to do. Form discussion groups around the principle. Maybe a Sunday morning or so, if you have not adopted this as yet. Just talk about it. Tell them that you heard it somewhere. You heard it here. And I want to know more about what this means. How could it be active within your congregation? And of course, when we think of COVID have ripped through Ohio. As of Friday, there were 1,072,312 cases that was reported. There were a death rate there. There were a sum of 19,284 individuals have died. And where is it that it has impacted more? In our marginalized communities. These communities have been affected. So therefore, how is it that you could find the ways and the means that we could be living in a world, living in a state as to whereby we are dismantling these oppressions in which is there. And those oppressions comes in various ways. It comes by healthcare, primarily right now because of COVID. We are seeing the disparities there. I'm not telling you anything in which you have not heard. You've heard this over and over again. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What is it that I will do about it? I love quoting what Martin Luther King said 58 years ago. Let me read what Martin Luther King said. He said that it is obvious today that America has defaulted on its promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people, or we may also say that also the Black indigenous people of color, a bad check. This is not the time to engage in luxury of cooling off or taking a tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make the real promises of democracy. That's what we heard about. This was written 58 years ago. And then Martin Luther King said, there will neither be rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. He said the whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice is emerged. Now, many of us recall a certain congresswoman talk about confrontational. Sometimes I wonder if the word revolt was said, what is it, the fact that those who are conservatives or align themselves in whatever train of thought would actually say. And yes, by means of obfuscation and misdirection and smoke and mirrors, we missed the point. Remember, this was the speech that was taken from I Have a Dream. Now, we hear about the I Have a Dream speech and we all go to little children should not look upon this color and blah, blah, and so forth. See, we miss the pure essence sometimes of what Martin Luther King is also saying here. He speaks about the whirlwinds of revolt will shake the foundation of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. 58 years ago, this was said. So friends, there is so much more that which I could say about what the eighth principle means for you and I, what the eighth principle endeavors to do with to become a part of our congregations in which you are, but also in your way of life. We're speaking about a way of life here, within the four walls in which you have within your church, but also outside of those four walls in which you have. We, the member congregations of Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant means an agreement. To affirm and promote means outside of our four walls, outside of ourselves, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. I'm going to urge you all, have the conversations in your congregation about what the proposed eighth principle could do for you. And when you're finished with that, have a discussion on widening the circles of concern. Have those discussions, and maybe it could be the change in which we want so that our faith will not be a dwindling faith, because others will come in, they will see that we are diverse, we are inclusive, and we are looking for justice. Any questions we have, could you put it in the chat, or you could unmute yourself, and let's talk about what this would mean for you. We have some time.
Samuel, do you mind if I give a comment or maybe
Absolutely.
a question? Sure.
Absolutely.
I love the idea of the principles growing with us as a faith. I really enjoy that idea. And I think the eighth principle is a great way to emphasize our mission to justice in our day and age. But a thought hit me recently, and I wonder if, for whatever reason, you use in like 100 years or so, might want to take away one of these eight principles and maybe replace it with something or modify it in some way. And I find that thought painful because they are also important to me. So I just want to kind of give that reflection that I'm enthusiastic for additions to it, but the thought of it being modifiable in terms of taking away brings me a bit of pain. But if that's what UU becomes in the future, I guess I'll probably be gone by then. But
yeah. Let me tell you something about that, Ted. I'm glad you asked that thought, or you're sharing that thought. And let me say this before I gather that thought. There's an eighth principle community group on Facebook that meets every month. I urge you to participate in that. I mean, you get various congregations, you get ministries, you have people come in, people are listening, people are sharing their thoughts, but there's a forbidden conversation that's been happening that this should be our only principle that we should have. So Ted, I hear you. I mean, the 7 principles is what brought me to UU. So I don't want to see it leave for me, but I also say, how is it that we could also evolve?
Samuel, let me just tell folk that we have enabled it so that you can raise your hand and unmute yourself if you want to ask a question that way, or you can type it into the chat. So either one. Please remember we're on Facebook Live, so do that accordingly. And there is a question that came in the chat. Let me phrase that one for you. Louise says, we have not yet begun the discussion of the eighth principle in our congregation. Are there suggested ways of moving it out from small discussion groups to the whole congregation?
Absolutely. Absolutely, there is ways. And the first way that I would suggest is to maybe a congregant to just stand on Zoom, raise their hand is what they're doing right now and say, could I make a comment? There is a proposed principle we have and read it. Just read it there. So therefore you would be announcing to the congregation that, yes, this is something in which I have learned. And therefore it would be asking the question, why is it that we're not doing that within our congregation? So there is ways as to how you can do that. And yes, there is ways, again, as I said, attend the Facebook community group. There is fabulous suggestions and ideas there that people have, the things in which they have done to move their congregation along. In Ohio right now, there are 3 congregations that have adopted this. 3, only 3. I think we have what, Joan, 28, I think, or 38 or something like that?
36.
36. So I think before General Assembly, we need to have all 36 congregations adopting the 8th principle. I know that's the fantasy, but the fantasies are not bad. Kelly.
Samuel, thank you. I just wanted to jump in and let you all know that there is a lot of information about our principles and the process that they're going right through right now to reevaluate them. And it's not because of the 8th principle. It is something that is part of our bylaws because we believe that the truth is continuing to unfold. And so in our bylaws as a denomination, it requires that we review our principles and our sources every 15 years and then present the changes to the General Assembly for voting. And this is one of the things that has allowed women to be named, so to speak. It has allowed us to even look at some of our other gendered language. There are so many wonderful things that this process brings to us. In fact, we would not have the 7th principle if it wasn't this idea that we can continue to change and grow. Reverend Joan is a wealth of knowledge, especially in terms of history. And I think most of us would be pretty surprised to see what the principles looked like when Unitarians and Universalists united. So I just want to, I guess, reassure all of us that this is a process that is trusted and has worked so well in the past, and that none of us are going to fall out. We're all going to be included in this. And part of what white supremacy culture does to us, white folks, is it works on our fear that we're going to fall out of the circle of life. And we won't, because our siblings of color, our transgender siblings, they love us and they want us to be liberated too. I apologize for interjecting so long.
No, it's quite fine. And that's a great thought, because the way is how the 7 principles, the kind of process, and individuals are always asking, where is the process? The process is the fact that it was introduced for a study commission in 2017, as I said. Now we're in 2021. the fact that what it has been noticed is the fact that change doesn't come more so from top down, right? Changes come from the bottom up. And grassroots efforts, and when I say grassroots, it means congregations have to put the pressure on the UUA board to say, hey, we're looking at this right now, but also in accordance to what Kelly just said. Last year, there was an Article 2 commission that was actually formed. And that the Article 2 commission is going to be looking at our bylaws, would be looking at our sources, and of course, how could it do all that without not looking at the principles? You know? So all that is kind of included into there, and therefore now, individuals also ask, what will happen with the it? Would it be these very same words? We don't know what these words are going to be. But the fortunate thing we have the fact that the Article 2 Commission, which was formed at General Assembly last year, have some strong individuals who are vetted into what the 8th principle is. So we know whatever form it comes out of, that is what it will be.
Samuel,
Yes, Jim.
Colette has her hand up, but before
I'm
that,
sorry.
I want to read a statement that Michelle put into the chat.
Please.
She says, I want to reread the book Centering, Navigating Race, Authenticity, and Power in Ministry again. Sometimes when I think, why do we need this? If it's inferred in the other 7 principles, then that book helps me remember, even with the 7, we are faltering. The explicit naming in a principle increases our commitment. So I wanted to share that. And then Colette has her hand up.
Yes, absolutely. Colette.
Hi, Samuel. Thank you very
Hello,
much.
Colette.
I love hearing your speak about the 8th principle. You know, it's dear to my heart. And at First Unitarian Toledo in Toledo, I was the chair of the strategic planning committee, and we put this forth, and our board has approved it, and we're going to, we're not adopting it, but we're going to vote on investigating it and working on activities, and then the next year we're going to vote on it. So that's our process. We've just started. I started last year. The pandemic kind of slowed us down, but we're moving forward, and I appreciate all your support in that. So I just want to say that, and I definitely think it's needed and long overdue. That's my humble opinion. So
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me give an example of the church that I am attending right now. Is Akron. So there is 40 people on this call. So I will tell you something. I used to go to the Church of the Larger Fellowship because for me, I felt they were doing what is required. I didn't join a brick and mortar church because for me to walk into a brick and mortar church, it had required effort on my part. Okay, so CLF have been, so for those of us who are not UUs, I shouldn't use, there we go, UUs and not the acronyms. CLF is the Church of the Larger Fellowship. And last year, I was living in Akron, then was not attending a brick and mortar church, and I received a call from two members in Akron. They said, we want to look at the 8th principle. And friends, I have to tell you, they say that there's always a tipping scale, right? There's always this curve that really, like the arc of justice takes a long time. There's always a tipping scale that occurs in people's lives there. And when they said, hey, could you be with us and so forth? And I said, sure. And friends, for 8 months, we did a deep dive into the 8th principle. Only 17 folks now. Akron is a little bit of a larger church, but the fact that was a tipping scale, because when you have 17 individuals are involved with that and talking about it and trying to see the ways as to how it can be a part of the church life and needed to be a part of the church life, we began to look at all of the committees, which was there in that church, and it is still occurring right now. So what they did is that they adopted the 8th principle, and of course the question always is, what happens next, right? What's next? Okay, so we adopted it. What's next? So what Akron did was to form an 8th principle transformation committee, which is looking right now at all of the ministries of that church, all of them. And so imagine you having committees, you're looking at leadership, you're looking at leadership development, you're looking at all the byproducts that comes with a church. And you're saying, how is it that you're living up to what the adopted 8th principle says? That is work, friends. That is work. The 8th principle transformation committee meets every other Saturday or Sunday. And yeah, it's work, because if we don't work, then change is not going to happen. And according to the question there that was asked, no, the minister at Akron was not involved with that. It didn't happen again. Let me repeat this. It did not happen from top down. It happened from the bottom up. So individuals were forcing the leaders of the church to take a look at this. So yes, and as it became known, the minister became involved, although the fact that Akron have an interim minister right now, so that all created that it was left up to the leaders of the church to actually move this out. And we're doing that now. And because of all that, I joined the Church of Akron. So now I have a church, a local church. You know, like Christine has a local church right now. I have a local church now. Yeah, Centering is a great book. It's a great book. I mean, it's not an although. It works in harmony with about the religious professionals and the issues in which they have had. So they sometimes become, because of the environment in which we have, as far as where congregations themselves are not looking at not the 8th principle, but really going an in-depth way of looking as far as what diversity is and how is it that race and racism could affect decisions in which they make. Sometimes it can create issues, and these issues you've heard of, friends. You've heard of these issues here.
Let me also point out that some people have shared some excellent connections and links in the chat to UUA websites focusing on the Article 2 Study Commission, as well as the 8th Principle. So y'all might want to check those out.
Yeah, you know, and also I would say, if you have the opportunity to get involved with local communities in your neighborhood. It may not be a physical connection in which you may want to do right now, but that's up to you. I would leave that in your hands. But you know, as long as you are integrating, you know, because when I think of the word integrate, when you're integrating within your leaderships, and when you're integrating other ideas and people, integration only works if there is a sharing of responsibility, resources, and being accountable. If we're not integrating people, if we're not integrating, well, then we're segregating, right? So as long as we could find the ways that we are responsible, whether we're sharing resources, whether we're being accountable, those areas would really help our churches to actually thrive.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to raise a hand, but can I ask a question?
Yes.
I guess my question is, because I think we often have an idea of what we don't want in the world and what we don't want the world to look like. And,
Hi,
you know,
Bridget.
hi, hello. And what we don't want our church to be doing or a way of being. But could you speak a little bit about the beauty of the transformation that our church and our denomination, like what will that look like? What will this beloved community look like if we were to adopt this eighth principle and do the widening of the circle? Because I think the potential for amazing transformation is there, and it helps if we could know like what it will be like and look like to embody
Yeah,
that.
that's a
So
great question, because I think sometimes seeing a white denomination is what we are, we sometimes think that if we make the changes, it will have more Black and brown people in our pews. Is that the goal? Or is it the goal that the spirit of what it is, and it's the spirit that attracts people to come? It's not the matter of having more Black and brown people. Yeah, numbers help. I get all that. You know, statistics helps. I understand all that. But if you have if you as a church have this spirit of what widening the circles mean to you, every action you do will be conducted in that way. Everything you do, which means your bylaws. What does your bylaws say? How is it that your bylaws attract people looking, you know, is it just? Is the bylaws you have just? I mean, an example in which I give of that is that when these principles was it made for Black and brown people? Was Black and brown people at the table? And people of color, were they there at the table when these laws, when the principles was being made? Maybe there were, maybe there weren't, but I do know there weren't many. There may not have been many. So the fact that when we are looking at the ways as to how we're trying to do governance, and again, I'm just speaking of the bylaws because as you were asking the question, that's what came to my mind. But when our bylaws is showing the fact that yes, we may have a statement in there that says we don't what is it that most bylaws have, that we're not that we don't hinder people in race or color or whatever, blah blah blah. And I don't mean to disrespect it by saying blah blah, but we have these statements, but then are you living into it? How are we living into the intersectionality of LGBTQ? Are we creating the space? And therefore, that could be carried over into what do you do for your sermons on Sunday mornings? Is your sermons inclusive? When you give sermons, is it inclusive of, I always say, and I will say this probably for until the day I die, whatever sermon you're giving, you could include justice in that sermon. You could be speaking of Thoreau, you could include justice. You could be speaking of Darwin, you could include justice. You could give in a intellectual service, whatever that may mean. You could include justice within that sermon. Because what we try to do is to reach people's hearts. And if we kind of just have one way of doing things, then in many places and spaces, we may just be speaking to a specific audience. And don't let me get started on speaking to a specific audience, when someone says that there is no racism in America. So, but we're not going to go there yet. I hope that answers your question, Bridget. Okay, Liz.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. We have a garden pond. It's very small, kind of like a local church. And if we don't keep that water oxygenated, yeah,
Oxygenate.
it gets really stagnant and yucky, and life doesn't thrive there. And so I'm wondering if we put off making more significant changes to our bylaws that actually names what we're trying to achieve. Do we start to become like the US constitutionalists who shun making any improvement to the country's core documents? You have to do something once in a while.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, if we don't always look for ways to create change, change will never, you will never have change. I used to be the president of a church, and the comment was made to me that made me resign from being in that church. And I'm going to say it, it's not a, well, we have to keep things in continuity. Continuity, we have to be continuity in doing. When I heard that word, it just turned me off. Because how is it that you could create change, even if you have a garden, even if you have this, even if you have that? How is it that you're continuing to grow? And having a garden for me is a perfect allegory towards how we grow. Because if you don't water that, if you don't look at your bylaws, if you don't say, you know what, maybe we need to look at the ways of how our bylaws are, and therefore, if we have a group of white people created a bylaws, then who are you creating the bylaws for? And what does the bylaws mean when it's being handed out? And therefore, how is it the inclusiveness within your bylaws? I urge you, Liz, to come to our widening the circles discussions in which we're going to be having on that. So come there and read the book if you can. Read the report, Widening the Circles of Concern. There's a governance structure right underneath there, which is have a platitude of ideas and thoughts and recommendations in which we could be, so that when we are speaking of bylaws and changes, how is it that we could do that?
Thank you.
You're so welcome. Well, Joan, it's 1:45. I'm going to put it back in your hands, my friend.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here and for, staying with us this afternoon for this really important conversation that we're having. What I want to ask right now is, what one thing do you think you will be taking home with you from all of this discussions this morning, and hearing about our voices together, and hearing what the legislators said, hearing what Samuel said? Is there something that you are going to take home with you? You can unmute yourself and speak it out in a sentence, or you can put it in chat. But let's hear what you're going to take home with you.
I'm going to start a group at my church to start looking at the 8th principle.
Excellent. Thank you, Bridget. Others, what are you going to take home with you? I'll start the work of the 8th principle, Louise says. Okay. And Colette says, thank you, Judy, for making the great quilton. Yes, definitely. Oh, yes, Judy's here. Fantastic artist. Others, what are you going to take home with you?
Joan, Tad here. I think I'm going to email Representative Janine Boyd right now and see if we can't grab coffee and talk about things.
Yes, yes, yes. All right. Another. What are you going to take? Liz, you're unmuted.
Do something and make it count.
Do something, make it count. All right. Others, what are you going to take home with you? Continued need for our voices and actions in public spaces, says Christine. Julie, I will continue to fight the good fight. Bless you so much. Other people, what are you going to take? Yeah, Joe. Go ahead, Joe.
One that came up this morning, and I think it applies to both in our church, and thank you, Bridget. We're church, both members of the same church. I'm glad Bridget's doing what she's doing. But one of the things that struck me about how both in our church and in our communities, work with friends on common interests. There are no permanent enemies. That was a very powerful statement for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have some in the chat. I will read centering to get going on the 8th principle, says Colette. We also have Michelle saying to go beyond calling my representatives, but also committee chairs, the governor. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Bob Lewis says more community organizing around state legislation, because that's where the rubber meets the road around here. Maureen says, I will join our voices together. Oh, please do. Definitely. Other things, what are you going to take home with you? Anybody else? Raise your hand or speak up. Okay. I'm also going to remind you about the auction. The bidding is starting today, and you can also get the link to the raffle there. Susan says she's going to contact some legislators. Better believe they don't bite. They're nice people. The ones we had today are nice people. They are not scary. Okay. So go talk with them. Go talk with them. Continue to discuss with our racial justice leadership team regarding bringing the 8th principle to the life of the congregation. And they're holding a conversation next Saturday regarding GA and the proposed statement of conscience. And this is Lori Albright. All right, Lori from up at UU Cleveland. Dan is saying work on the 8th principle and remember Samuel's words, blessings. Yes, we are recording this stuff, by the way. Anybody else? Last call for what you're going to be taking home with you. All right. Absolutely excellent. Doing 2 Zoom calls, CJ says, at the same time today, because she's supporting a young Black candidate who's running for office. Bless you, CJ. Absolutely. And does anyone else attend West Shore? Yes, there are several, Michelle. There's several West Shore folk here. I would say jump on to the action list that we have, because that way we'll be able to help people make connections with one another too. Marlene says talk to others about the 8th principle. That is great. Okay. Anything else that folk are typing in there? All right. Then I am going to say finally one final thank you to everybody for being here. And I am going to turn it over to Reverend Kelly, who will give us a benediction and blessing as we leave for the afternoon.
Thank you so much, Reverend Joan. I send us out back into the world with words from our beloved former UUA president, William Sinkford. These are adapted, and we are a gentle and generous people, but let us not forget our anger. May it fuel not only our commitment to compassion, but also our commitment to make fundamental changes. Our vision of the beloved community must stand against a vision that would allow the privilege of the few to be accepted as just and even holy. Our religious vision must again and again ask, who is my neighbor? And strive always to include more and more of us. As we intone the words that gave birth to this nation, we the people, we are, and we should be, both a gentle and an angry people. Thank you, Joan. Thank you all. Blessings in this work. Remember, we are not alone.